Welcome to the Technical Committee, Meet the Technical Committee session. This is kind of traditional DebConf session where the Technical Committee members sit on a stage and either get asked some questions or have something to say. I'm Stefano Rivera. I'm a relative newcomer to the committee, and Sean is near the end of his time on the Technical Committee, and he's going to share some thoughts about what the role of the Technical Committee should be.
Yeah, I'll share a few thoughts. I'm hoping to state the problem and have you guys come up with a solution. That would be the hope. So the Technical Committee. Who's on the Technical Committee? Here we are. These are the current Tech Committee members. Me, Christoph, two Matthews, Helmut, Stefano, Timo, and Craig. We'd like to thank our former members. So these are the members of the Technical Committee who've been appointed since the constitutional reforms that imposed term limits. This is pretty much them. And then this is an overlap. So DDA was since the constitutional reforms, and now we're getting back into the older members where it's not known when they joined. So back in the midst of time of 2014, there weren't term limits, and the committee people joined until they got sick of it. So these are the people who from that era. What can the Technical Committee do? So unusually, the Technical Committee what it can do is strongly defined. It's written down in the Constitution, and these are the powers that we have. We get to make technical decisions. Essentially, if policy is what we do in the ideal world, the TC is how policy ends up shaking out in packages in the real world, something like that. So when developers' jurisdiction, this is the key one, when developers' jurisdictions overlap and it's not clear who gets to decide and they disagree, right, then the TC decides. That's the idea. And we can, usually it's consensual, so people come to the TC and say, we can't decide, it's obvious we overlap, can you decide for us? Sometimes it's not, and we have to overrule a developer, but that requires us to have a 3-to-1 majority, so it doesn't happen very often. The TC also has this advice-giving role. So the idea is, if the decision is too much for you as a package maintainer, you can turn it over to the TC. And often we end up giving advice instead of deciding because we think it's too premature to be done by force. So we often choose to use this power ourselves, even if people have come to us under one of the other powers. This is the wrong version of my slides. There were some additional constraints that I listed, but I'll talk about them. So the Constitution constrains these powers in various ways. The first one is that we have to do everything in public. We're meant to choose between options on the table as opposed to coming up with new ones. That's a pretty significant restriction because it means that if there aren't good options on the table, then we have to say, okay, we can't be involved. The Constitution says we can't do design work. And we're meant to be used only as a last resort, but of course we have to decide whether it's a last resort yet. That's part of the challenge. On my other version of the slides, a couple of additional constraints. We can't overrule delegates. So if a project delegate has made a decision in their capacity as a delegate, then the TC can't be involved. So there's quite a specific restriction which people don't always realize. So that's why I say the TC is the policy in the real world, because delegates are dealing with project matters that are less about the contents of packages. That's the idea there. So for example, if it's the release team who you disagree with, then we're just going to close the bug because we're not able to do anything. I also wanted to mention that there's some weird consequences of exactly what the Constitution says we're allowed to do. So the TC is the only body that can, it's kind of like an afterthought in a sentence in the Constitution, but it's quite significant. The only body who can change the maintainer of a package, right? So even if DAM decide that someone should be removed from the project, the uploads can still be sponsored, right? So the TC is the only people who can do that, and we never do it. So the consequence is that we have this informally defined role of the package maintainer who ends up having almost all of the power, unless there's a delegate, a relevant delegate. So that's the decision process that's written in the Constitution. Once that gets through to reality, it doesn't always seem how you might think it was intended to be. And the reason it's called the Technical Committee is because it's meant to decide technical matters and not social matters. But that almost never happens. The disputes that come before the TC almost always have a social component. And when we look at the current issues, you'll see what I mean. Ian Jackson wrote the Constitution as a grad student in the 90s, and he had this idea that, oh, we'll cleanly separate, I don't think he'll mind me saying this, we'll cleanly separate the technical and the social. We'll have this committee structure to make technical decisions when people disagree. If people are misbehaving, then we'll deal with that in a different way. And that doesn't work, right? Because all these issues always come entangled. And so on the TC, we try to link up with DAM and with the community team to make progress together, but we're not the same team. We're appointed for different reasons, and that leads to no end of problems. I think Ian considers that to be a great mistake. That is his view of the matter. There obviously are advantages to it, right? Which is that I think a lot of the people who work on the TC wouldn't be willing to join DAM, right? I know I wouldn't. So there are advantages to that separation, but it also causes us no end of problems. I wanted to make a comparison to a couple of other projects at this point who don't have this separation, so or have it to a different degree. So Matthew Garrett, who's on the TC, has also served on the Fedora project's engineering steering committee, which is the closest thing that they have. And that structure, I'm not sure about discipline, but they do set direction as opposed to merely choosing between options. And then as another example, the FreeBSD project have this core team, which is elected, like the TC, and they have a term, they serve for, I think it's 2 years, maybe 3 years. And they are explicitly empowered to deal with issues that are both technical and social. And that project they don't seem to have a lot of controversy over there, which is, I think we should consider looking at some of these other options. The TC have tried to change how we work several times over the time I've been on it, but we don't really have the will, because we're like, oh, we shouldn't just be deciding how this works, right? The project should be deciding, but and we're also trying to do the day-to-day work of the TC, and so I don't know what to do with that, but that's the situation. I said I was going to state problems. So to summarize, the Constitution says that we break ties, right, when solving it via consensus has been tried and failed, and we can offer advice. That's the body. And this is Gunar's summary from a few years ago. The TC is self-nominated, DPL appointed, last resort, conflict resolution, and advice providing body. Okay, so that's my introduction. I'll talk about the issues that there've been before the TC in the past year. That's a traditional part of this talk. So we vote on membership and for the chair. So we've had one appointment since the last DebConf. That's Craig. And now we are up to 8 members now, which is nice. That's where we want to be. And there's this. We vote for the chair every time the TC membership changes. So the idea is that the chair always has the support of the committee, because we hold that vote again. You can see that bug number was just a little bit after Craig. These are some decisions that we made. These are bugs that were filed, and they led to a resolution in a clean way. So Ian Jackson filed 105.0.0.1. He asked us to reconsider the merged user migration in light of some specific things that had happened. We assessed the proposal and decided to stick with what we were already doing. The second bug was pretty procedural. We'd imposed a moratorium on file movement that was needed to keep the transition going, and the next step was to repeal it, so we did. It was uncontroversial. And someone raised a pretty complicated issue about a couple of interacting packages, and as I mentioned earlier, this is one of the cases where we turned it into giving advice because we thought that was what was helpful. There's some bugs. We very often, you see there's 3 bugs that were decided and 3 bugs that were closed without a resolution because we thought they were premature. So a couple of disputes were brought to us, and there weren't options to choose from, and it also clear that consensus-based methods hadn't been tried hard enough, so we just said that we weren't going to be involved. And this bug resolved itself while we were still talking about it, so that's always nice. We have one open issue, so this is a classic overlapping responsibility issue where the maintainers of 2 packages, who has ownership over an API, basically, is that a fair description? A package-based API, one side thinks that they're implementing correctly, the other side says they're not. So we're trying to mediate. We hope to resolve it without having to use a formal resolution. So I mentioned term expiry. So there's this algorithm for expiring members of the committee, and I think the rationale is not written down anywhere that I've found. The idea is to avoid the committee suddenly shrinking, right? So the idea is that only 2 people can retire at once. So this is the current expected retirements if no one resigns. So I'm finishing this year, Christoph next year, and then the rest of the committee are here. So that means that we need to appoint people. So as a result of this expiry, we're usually looking for 1 to 2 people a year. This year 1, I guess, because I'll be leaving. And the TC, a lot of our time, in fact, gets taken up with this process of recruitment because not many people want to do it. So we wanted to say that it's not as bad as people sometimes think it is. So 7277008 is the systemd bug, and with its current structure, no matter its problems, one advantage is it's really not that bad because there's not very much we can do. Maybe that's a problem, but if you'd like to make our recruitment process easier by getting involved to help keep this stuff ticking over, then it's a pretty nice way to help the project. The workload is really not that bad. So we had this idea of talking about a typical month. We have a meeting once a month, IRC generally. We spend an hour on our meeting, and we just look at each open issue and see if we can move it forward, right? And then we assign individual members of the committee to pursue the relevant issue. So, maybe Helmut's like, well, I know what should happen in this user merge bug. We should probably do this next. And we're like, yeah, okay, that sounds good. Maybe you should try this. Make some modifications, and then we assign Helmut to do it, and he goes and does it. And then we do this for each bug, and the work gets divided out pretty evenly, and we just make this steady progress. It's really not that bad. Sometimes there are a lot of emails, but because we have to act together, everything kind of centers around these monthly meetings, which maybe means we act too slow, but that's the reality of it. Please consider nominating yourself. So here's another nice summary. So the work is often more social than technical. It is about disagreements, and it does sometimes involve taking hard decisions. But as a group, right? No one has, except the chair sometimes, but it's never happened to me. It all on their shoulders. So, as I say, given that it's mostly about resolving disputes, the required skill set is this kind of stuff. But it's people who are generally in good faith, right? It's not like a more disciplinary role. We could do with more diversity. So I had an interesting conversation about this on the train this morning because somebody who had previously self-nominated, I think they'd been nominated, but they ended up turning it down. I think that's what happened. They were like, well, the thing is, there's a lot of English that gets produced in technical committee disputes. It's not my first language, so it's a lot to be involved, right? And I was thinking, yeah, but then only people from an English-speaking culture end up on the TC, which sucks. So I think we could probably do better about, like, all of Debian should probably write less, right? But maybe we should, if we did that in particular, people would be more willing to be involved in the TC. That would be pretty cool. You can nominate yourself or you can nominate someone else. We particularly like self-nominations because if you nominate someone else, then we have to confirm with them, and they often say no. But if you think there's someone who would be good, then please nominate them. We tend to have, once we've filtered through the people who are willing to do it, we tend to be deciding between like 3 people. It would be great if we were deciding between 5 or 6, say, right? And then we often say to people, well, can you come back next year? And they do, and then they join a year later, and it works. It's slow because we don't get enough nominations. So please consider nominating yourself or someone else. And while Stefano and I are here at DebConf, then if there's stuff that's brewing, we'd love to hear about it in person. That would be great. So that's our talk. Thank you. We'd love to talk about any of these issues.
Hi, I'm Andreas. Thank you for all your work in the technical committee for doing this. You said it's quite some overlap between technical and social aspects. We once had the idea, I think a couple of years ago, in Debian Private, that we might have kinds of a social committee or so. Do you think such kind of would make sense or not?
Should I speak first?
I don't have a thoughts on that yet. I need to think for a moment.
Well, I mean, I suppose in theory that's the community team, right? But they used to be called anti-harassment, and they have that name for a reason. That's their focus. I think the thing to do is to look at other projects, right? We can try and come up with these structures on our own, but the thing that tests these approaches is experience, and we're not the only project of this size and trying to do this sort of stuff. So I think the thing to do is to look at other structures and come up with a hybrid that suits Debian's particular needs.
Looking at the bugs we've seen, the technical issues come to us because personalities are conflicting. If people were able to communicate and work with each other, they would probably have reached a solution. It's not that there were 2 perfect options that they had to choose between. It's because they couldn't come to an agreement. And that's inherently social, but on a technical decision.
Right.
Yeah.
Hi. I have a comment on the previous question. So if this is interesting, we can have a conversation about how the Ubuntu community handles this. So there's a community council, and there's a community team at Canonical, and there's a structure. And if you want a conversation, I'll be here the whole week. So find the orange guy. Right?
That would be great. Thank you. Let's do that.
Thank you.
Thank you for being the technical committee. I appreciate that this social aspect of Debian is held together by your team. I really like to help, but I will be nervous to volunteer. How much work does it involve? Like once a month sounds very small, but you know, what does it mean? Do I have to read like 1,000 pages of literature to every month to participate?
So we tend to ask people to summarize. So we're generally not willing to read entire disputes. We say, can each side please come up with a summary of how it seems to them? So it's not that bad. Like, if there's an existing bug, we'll try to look at it, but we expect people to write in the TC bug some kind of summary. If people just reassign a bug to the TC, that happens sometimes, then we just say, we're not dealing with it that way. So we want to make decisions faster than we do. So we know that everyone's busy, so we don't accept too much stuff. The thing that we tend to need is people to be able to jump in quickly, right? So you need to be willing to come in with a few hours in any given week, right? But it doesn't mean you have to randomly give up hours and hours and hours.
But bugs do tend to come to the committee with a lot of text. Like a typical TC bug, the submitter will go to an effort to explain what the problem is, and it means a long read. And then usually there's a mailing list thread you've got to go and read as well, maybe a few of them. Actually requiring the committee to do all of that reading before any discussion happens would bog things down a bit. We've been lucky recently that we've been able to have somebody take on the role of doing research for the committee and going to figure out what the best solution for something should be is. And then they can explain that to us, and we can usually decide to, trust them on this matter. And we will still discuss technical details, but we can fall back on them as an expert within the team.
Yeah, and when it doesn't happen, when there is just too much text, we just stop, right?
Yeah.
we don't. No one is expected. No one on the committee expects anyone else on the committee to read everything.
It'll be impossible.
No.
So you hinted to some limitations and problems in the technical committee. Would you change some things if you could, or do you think you also hinted that you think there's some bigger rework in Debian that's needed between tech committee and what would you do if you had a choice, either one of you? Would you fix a few things in TC, or rather start a discussion to redesign what our top level problem handling methods are?
Well, no one is happy with Debian's governance, right? We're really bad at making changes, and we all know that we need to make changes, but there's so many issues at once. I'm not an expert in that kind of stuff. If it was up to me, then I would try to become one, right? I'd go and look at what everyone else does and see what works and doesn't work and try to integrate it with our stuff. I don't want to stand here and say I would make this change without doing that research.
I'm also very interested in how other people are doing it, and lots of people are doing it really poorly, so just the data point to that one.
Debian is also quite different to other distributions in that we don't have a company enforcing a top-down agenda for the project. So we largely rudderless. We might have a DPL that runs on a platform of a particular technical goal that the project should achieve, but that's been rare, and a lot of the project looks down on that, and we seem to prefer administrative leaders to leading leaders. I don't see the technical committee as being able to have any role in that game at the moment. That would require a constitutional change, and I'm not sure that having some greybeards drive the direction of the project is what Debian wants.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much. No more questions, I think. So, I guess, shall we call it a day? Thank you very much for listening.